This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Well, here we are again in universal time, and it's not Disney time, it's real time. But the real time is your time. And your time is your opportunity to hear this message this morning, which is brought to you by Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley, the voice of Respectonomics, and co-host Sarah Benton. And in honor of the actual physicality of when we are meeting, I shall say, in all truth and sincerity, good morning, Sarah.
Good morning, Jeremy.
You see how nicely we do that, and everybody else can pick their own times. This morning, what we're going to be talking about is, loosely speaking, the word prospecting. And the title to this is, in fact, Prospecting with a Compass. And as you know, we talk about the Compass Point series, which is what this is. The compass is central theme to Respectonomics because it's a way of giving ourselves navigational aids through life and business. And if we're going to go prospecting, having a compass in your hand is actually quite a good idea. Now, most people, you and I come from a commercial world when we think of prospecting as meaning getting more customers or clients.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, though, in the wide world, when you say prospecting, most people actually think you mean going out into the wild wilderness and looking for gold and silver.
Interesting.
That is the prospector, and you see this in the old movies and all that stuff. But it is interesting. When the prospector goes out, there are two things. He often has a compass in his hand. You may have noticed that. He might be a grizzly old guy in the Rockies or something, but there he is with a compass. But here's something really important. When he goes out prospecting, he goes out with tools. He doesn't just go out in his bare hands. He doesn't just go out even with a pair of leather gloves. He goes out with pickaxes and measuring stuff, and in today's world with all kinds of hi-fi size stuff and all that. But there's a whole mechanism, there's a whole toolbox that goes with the prospector.
So I certainly think, metaphorically speaking, you're
Yes.
going to share with us what those tools and resources are for us.
Well, precisely. And you're in your other line of business is in real estate development and so on. And what's interesting is that the concept of prospecting, of going out and looking for customers, it's actually not even metaphorical. It's exactly the same principle.
Right.
And I want to make 2 points before we get into the meat and potatoes, about actually what are the tools. But there are two things about prospecting I find interesting. One is you normally go out with a purpose. You don't usually, if you said to the miner, the geologist, what are you going to do today? And he said, I'm going prospecting. Your next question would be, well, what are you prospecting for?
Right.
It is unlikely that the individual would say, I don't know.
It's usually with intention and purpose.
Intention and purpose. So we're going to be talking about purpose, but also the other thing is when the prospector goes out, he might quite reasonably say, I'm going to look for zinc, I'm looking for oil, I'm looking for whatever it is. But that prospector is savvy enough to know he might come across some other important mineral, gem, whatever it might be. So in other words, it's not a singularity of purpose as much as having an intention, which you allow to broaden out into other findings. And that's true in our life as business people. When we go out prospecting for new customers and clients, we may be going for a certain category, quality, whatever principle. I think you and I agree, now and again you come across some gems, and you want to be very, very sure that you give that gem all the openings and possibilities you can.
I was just going to say, be open to opportunities.
Yeah, exactly. So the prospector does that, we do that. Now, the other thing that's interesting about prospecting, a lot of people will say things like, well, I don't prospect. Well, actually you do. You go to the grocery store and you go prospecting for the best value. You go prospecting for the finest head of lettuce or cabbage or something. The truth of the matter is we're all in the business of prospecting in one way or another. Even when you get into the car to drive somewhere, you are prospecting. You're prospecting the best route. You're prospecting the traffic jams. You're prospecting somebody who darts out from the side.
It's
So
a plural almost in every facet of our
it's in
day-to-day
every facet.
from
So,
what prospecting means.
mhm. So I think what all we're trying to do this morning is, or I shouldn't say this morning, should I? At this particular time, what we're doing here is examining, to assessing some of the techniques, some of the tools that are useful in prospecting for new customers. Now,
Fantastic.
I've got a new word for you, and it's
Uh,
not Latin this time. Well, it actually does have Latin origins. Might even have Greek, I'm not sure. But there are actually three words in the concept of prospecting that are important.
okay.
And they are prospection,
Yes.
inspection,
Yes.
and retrospection.
Fabulous.
Yeah, and they're not words that you sort of wake up in the morning and saying, "Hello, I'm into the business of retrospection." They're not easy words to come to grips with.
Right.
But the principles are very important. That when we go out looking for that proverbial, and let's just say new customer, and we'll say that all the way through this discussion, the new customer. When we go out, there are two things or three things we need to do with that. The first one is it's very healthy to have a look at yourself. In other words, when that prospect went out to look for gold or oil, whatever he was looking for, we need to look at ourselves and make sure that we are fully equipped. I think there's a tendency to go out into the world of prospecting and just saying, "Oh, I'll just pick up the phone and call somebody, or I'll write to them, or I'll bump into somebody." Checking yourself over before you go. I mean, you often do that, for heaven's sake, when you leave your front door. How often, I'll give you a good example. When I leave the front door, I look in the mirror to see if my tie is straight.
There you go.
Yeah. So
Is
I
it
think,
about process
what's
or
that?
is it about a process or planning?
I think it's more in the process than the planning. I think the planning is the intent of prospecting and looking for a certain type of customer. What I think all we're saying is take a look at yourself before you go out. Check yourself over. If you're feeling good about yourself, good. If you're not feeling good about yourself, we've talked about the fears of rejection and so on in previous podcasts. But what I'm getting at is it's a good idea to check yourself over. And
Mhm.
as you go out to do this, whether it's picking up the phone or whatever it is, a very healthy technique is to engage in retrospection, which means looking back over your career, over the life that you've had, and all the pieces that have come to you that have made that particular opportunity possible.
Right.
It's almost a sense of gratitude, that sense of, well, I went to a decent school, I had decent parents, I had a decent boss, I had a decent whatever it is. But it's a useful technique looking back for 30 seconds and saying, huh, you know, this is something that I've got to where I am and I'm really grateful for it. And the
Do you think
interest, sorry,
I was just gonna say, do you think it's a thought process in terms of what's the value that I could add?
absolutely. Because not only the value that you add, the way you've described it, but it's also got another benefit to it. It's how you feel when you, that sense of gratitude, that sense of, I've got history behind me, I've got backup, I can verify my information and so on. That comes out in the projection and the delivery of your entreaty to your application to your new customer.
Right.
People love to know that you've come from somewhere. One of
Right.
the classic sales tools, as you well know, is to do a certain amount of self-disclosure. You meet somebody for the first time and you say, "My name is, and I live wherever I live. I have an office in the barn,"
Right.
whatever it is, but little things that are, they're fun to know. But that self-disclosure is very warming. So having retrospection in your hip pocket, having a bit of inspection in your hip pocket, they both add to that demeanor, that attitude that you create when you're meeting somebody.
Right.
So now that we've got that out of the way, or in the way, we now talk about the actual act of prospecting.
Okay.
And I have two things I really want to emphasize. The first is, and this came from your uncle, so
Uh-huh.
I can't claim originality, but I will put it to you this way. let's say that your concept of prospecting is to telephone somebody. Fair
Yeah.
enough. I mean, just there are different ways of doing it. I'm
Mhm.
just talking here
Yeah.
about calling somebody. But the principle is identical wherever we are. And that is you answer the phone and you say, Sarah here. And I say, it's Jeremy calling. And here's the time honored question. Do you have a minute to speak to me now, please? And
Okay.
nobody ever asks you that.
Mm.
And I say nobody's a big word, isn't it? But you listen to the calls you get. The local contractor calls you, the car dealer calls you, your bank calls you, whatever it is calls you. They never say, "Do you have a minute to speak now, please?"
I'm going to be the devil's advocate here. What
Get
if
out
the
of
is no?
ah. That's the answer you want
Mhm.
because not because you want that in a literal sense, but what you're trying to do is my classic is it happened to me once. This one. I got a phone call. They were doing a survey on retail attitudes or something in the local community. A perfectly legitimate call. As it happened, I was at home unusually at that time, and I was down with the flu. She, as it happened, barreled on about the survey they were doing, and I just could not handle the call. And I said, "No, thank you, not interested."
Right.
That's not true. Of course, I was interested. It was central to my community living and how I do my business or did my business and so on. But if she had said to me, "Have you got a minute to speak to me now, please?" I would have said, "Actually, let's have a chat later on. I'm not feeling very well at the moment."
Do you feel in your experience
Hmm.
that people would use that phrase and it not necessarily being sincere, but a way of politely saying, "No, thank you"?
I don't think I never really came across a no thank you. If I did, we will talk about the no thank yous as a specific objection,
Okay.
as specifically.
Maybe that's an entirely other podcast.
It probably is actually, but in brief though, that when somebody says no thank you, if it's a complete shove off, they don't want to talk to you. Sometimes that's a blessing in disguise because
Right.
the chemistry isn't there.
Fair enough.
Possibly. But what I have found is 95% of the time, the answer I got was, yes, I do, or no, I don't. Would you call me back later? I think we tend, as prospectors, as salespeople, I think we tend to think of what's the worst reply I'm going to get.
No.
And actually, 95% of the time, you never get the worst reply that you can imagine.
Right.
You usually get an answer, yes, what's it all about? So
Right.
that question is, do you have a minute to speak to me now, please? I think it's courteous and under the heading of respectonomics, it provides dignity. It doesn't, it means you're sort of standing at the door and saying, may I come in, basically.
Right.
So that's the principle behind it.
Okay.
Then when you get into the next part of the puzzle, here's the key, I think. I said there were two things. There's that. And the other part is this. I know respectonomics talks a lot about the body and the mind and we call it the soul or the inner being.
Right.
Everybody has their definition. But one of the things that I think are absolutely crucial to prospecting is that one word body. And what I mean by that is I never had any serious success in anything that didn't involve personal contact. The personal body to body contact was essential. I mean, yes, there
So
was
do you mean physically being present in front of another?
yeah, yes.
Okay.
I mean, the phone call was an enabling act. So yes, Sarah, may I please come and see you tomorrow at 2:15? Yes, that'll work for me, blah, blah. But the point I'm getting at is the substance of that was that we were going to get together.
Mm.
I don't know your experience, mine certainly was that if somebody said, oh, that's very interesting, put something in the mail to me, I pretty much saw that as don't bother to go on.
Right.
Because once you take the body part out of it, it's very hard to get mind and soul in gear as well. And
Fair.
I think if you try and get the mind there ahead of the body, it doesn't work.
Mm.
So I think that the body part of it is very important. And in a world where people are getting very automated, very roboticized and all this, the body to body is a very important differentiating tool.
Mm.
Saying to
This is
somebody, I'm coming to see you. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that in your real estate development, you've always made a point of going to see the client. I think that's
absolutely.
I think that's been your mantra. I mean, every time I
Yeah,
call you, you
and then
say,
from that point on, you can understand what is their preferred method of contact or additional engagement
yeah,
or, part of the process,
yeah,
but physically being present.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I think that's the body part of it. We said about the intent of the prospector. My intent as a prospector talking to you is to provide or to create an opportunity for you and me to get together. That's all I have to do. I don't have to go, I don't have to sell you anything. I don't have to buy anything. I don't have to persuade you. All I have to do, my intent is to be in front of you. That's it.
Okay.
Very straightforward. And then we have this whole business of what is it that I can do that differentiates me when I call you? One general comment is for people who are in the sales process, and corporations should listen up on this one, is how many times do you ever get prospected realistically? And the answer is in the last 5 years, I have not had a phone call from insurance. I haven't had a phone call from a car dealer, real estate, which I mean, the real estate one fascinates me because here we are sitting in, the town of Blue Mountains. You'd think that people would be prospecting, saying, have you ever thought of dividing, selling, succeeding, something? Never
Sure.
had it. So I think all I'm saying anecdotally rather than statistically, but anecdotally, you don't get a lot of prospecting calls. So if you do a prospecting call, number one, you're differentiating yourself. And secondly, when you do it, if you do it well, you really do differentiate yourself. And there are techniques and tools to doing it, which we're now going to talk about. But
Right.
before we do that, do you have any thoughts on this general principle of prospecting?
So my only, I guess, thought that
Mhm.
may have reduced the phone call portion
Mhm.
of prospecting versus another myriad of
Right.
ways that you can do that would be the do not call list, right? From a privacy perspective. So that could potentially impact maybe perhaps
Absolutely.
some
Yeah.
portion
Yeah.
of why people are not
Yeah.
receiving those phone calls anymore. People are very quick, I find, to just kind of put a blanket statement over everything and saying, "Nope, do not contact me by telephone."
Right.
Right?
And in fairness, I think that one of the reasons for that is because we've all had those ridiculous calls
Yeah. You've either
that,
been inundated or
yeah, and they're ridiculous. I mean,
not
I don't know
something
what,
place of value or
yeah,
service,
yeah.
right?
So it's understandable. But let's go back to the prospector. The prospector goes to the edge of the mountain and there's a big sign there with government writing all over it says, do not enter.
Right.
Well, the prospector says, okay, that area is out of control. I'll try this one. And
Right.
then when you try the other one, just remember that one of the techniques to prospecting is that you create an opportunity for obtaining referrals. So in other words, once you've developed the relationship with the customer,
Right.
one of the determinants is to say, and given the techniques that we use, would you
Right.
think there are friends of yours in your particular community, your particular orbit, that would be interested in what we do? I'm going off at a tangent here, but here it is. One of the risks of asking for a referral, if I come up to you right now and say, Sarah, I need a referral in, I don't know, well, building respectonomics, your mind goes blank.
Right.
You just don't come out, it just doesn't do. But if I say, on the other hand, Sarah, you're in the world of real estate and real estate development, do you have people in that corridor who would be interested in respectonomics? You immediately think of two or three people.
Right.
So it's very respectful of you that I'm recognizing your sphere of influence.
Right.
And it's also very, what's the word? It triggers a really, really good answer.
Well,
But
it also taps into that individual feeling good about their arena of
um,
expertise, right? And the
mm,
value or
yeah,
the, impact that that individual has within their arena as well.
absolutely. Asking for referral is one of the greatest compliments you could ever give anybody. You're doing such a good job, and you know so many people in your trade, and you've got such a great, you know, level of what would you call it? Well, authority or influence. I would love to work with that.
Right,
That's a
right,
very powerful statement. The other thing is this: when I ask you for a referral, I'm implicitly saying my line of business is very successful and will help you and prosper you. In other words, I'm actually building up my product by asking you for a referral.
right,
It's
right.
brilliant. So anyway, but we haven't got through this other part to it, which is that I'm now on the phone and I'll say on the phone, this is a conversation you hit a nail upon the head. And that is, if there's a DNC you can't call, my prospecting still doesn't put any limits on the people that I meet in the general public, whether I'm at the proverbial coffee shop or whether I'm at a symposium, wherever I might be. I have the right or the ability to be able to say to somebody, effectively, will you do business with me? I mean,
So again, that boils back down to that physical presence,
absolutely.
contact, community,
Yeah. Yeah.
groups, right? Yeah,
Yeah. So using that, one of the keys is, and you've seen this, I've seen it, and many, many organizations do it. Look at their ads in the paper, for example, and they have these wonderful expressions of trust me. Our organization is built on trust and integrity. You know, our people are the emblem of trust. And you get these things thrown in your face. And it's actually very interesting that in the world of governance, the word trust never appears.
mm,
So, in other words, what you need to do is to establish a base that differentiates you from the proverbial madding crowd. And the way we do that is to say to someone, is to say, we believe we do our business quite differently. And you're a very good example of that. And I hope anybody listening to this will pick up on it because you do your business differently. And when you say, we do our business, and I said we, by the way,
right.
because we is much more powerful than I.
Mm,
So when you say we do our business quite differently, you nearly always get well, what do you mean you do it differently?
mm,
Because most people don't believe that anybody does anything differently.
right,
It's all homogenous, pink blancmange and all that stuff. And you say you do your business differently, you get an immediate response.
right.
And then you say you give them a defining benefit of what you do that is different. So in my world, and I'm being very narrow here, talking about my world, I would say we use a number of techniques to evaluate securities. And one of the techniques we use is under the Insider Trading Act to find out which senior officers and directors are buying and selling securities in their own company. Because if I can find out, and it's public information, if I find out who is buying in a particular security and that individual's an officer or a director of the company, that's usually a pretty good clue that we should be buying as well.
Mm, okay,
Similarly, if the person's selling, you would say, I think I'd better get into the lifeboat too. So you're differentiating yourself. And then you say, once you've identified your differentiating point, and in respect to nomics, the differentiating point that we make over and over again is not that we have the solution, but what we emphasize over and again is the dignity of the human being and the willingness, the commitment to honor other people's freedom of choice. Those are two expressions you do not hear very often. So that differentiates Respectonomics from other platforms that deal with helping people to improve their business life, their living life, and so on. But with that in mind, I've now differentiated myself. And once I've done that, I then have the right to say, we use other techniques. I would like to meet with you to share these other techniques and see how they apply to your particular situation.
right.
So I've established the trust points. I've got to the concept of the body to the body, the physicality of getting together. And I've differentiated myself in the sense that, yes, I'm going to bring you something that is designed to help you, but you won't find it on the main street. And I'm sorry, I was going to say one thing, sir. What we're doing, and you do it in your business, I know this, is you provide verifiable information,
Right.
information that you can verify as to consistency, accuracy, and reliability. Sound like big words, but even when you do it and you have it in your heart and soul, boy, does that go over well.
I feel like that takes us, it's a nice segue to trust points. Tell me about trust points.
Well, trust points are precisely those differentiating issues. For me to come to you and say, trust me, respectonomics is a good example. But one of the most important things that we can obtain is when somebody, and I got a letter, well, you and I got a letter last week from an individual who stated how important our messages are. That is a third party proof benefit. And that in itself is a trust point. The fact that we do 2 podcasts every Monday morning is part of the trust process. We're in the business of building trust. We do not go out there saying, trust me. We go out there saying, here are the benefits that we perceive that are useful to helping people in their lives. We also were very fortunate. We belong to a group of people. What is it? 8 or 9 of us altogether.
Mhm.
It's a group, it's a team that is very, very able and willing to catch criticism and catch, if it's praise, great, I'll take it. But more importantly, when there's a sand in the gearbox, that we get told about it. I think that's one of the most valuable things. And I think being able to say to a prospect or to a client and say, we have a group behind us that is keeping an eye on the continuity and the integrity of our business, I think that's a really important point. There is a trust point.
Absolutely.
But I want to make one other comment, Sarah, if I may, please. And that is this business of prospecting. We talk about it kind of emphatically, and I think it is. I think it's a great way. It's called building capacity.
Mhm.
Anybody's got a business of any kind or shape. It doesn't matter if you're a school teacher or whether you're a CEO of a computer business. You're always trying to build capacity.
Right.
And we're talking about building capacity through prospecting. But have you noticed in corporations, you get this Monday morning message that says, whom are you going to prospect this week? Who's in your pipeline? Blah, 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 blah. And one of the keys to prospecting is that we also need to prospect our employees. We need to prospect our customers, existing customers, and we need to prospect our suppliers. In other words, one of the great risks of prospecting is we put it above taking care of our existing base.
Right. One of the ways that I like to look at that, or sort of an application that just seems it's natural for me, I feel like, is to remove the word transactional. Because
Oh,
a lot of businesses are transactional.
mhm,
And so I find if well, and again, I think this is either it's natural and innate in somebody or a business, or it's not.
mhm,
If you remove the transaction intention around it and you're coming from a place of service and focused on the right things and focused on people, which you're talking about in terms of from a leadership, whether it's leadership
mhm,
to employees or whether it's from employees
yeah,
to their clients. If you remove the concept of transaction and make it about relationships and the value and the service that you can provide and you can add to that experience or to that concept or the negotiations or the prospecting, I think it can have a tremendous impact on how you do business. And more back to what you spoke about earlier when you were talking about from, your business coming from a source of referrals.
mhm.
I think it can have a tremendous impact. I'm not quite sure how else to express it.
Well,
However, that's something that is very paramount for
yeah,
me in terms of how I feel
mhm,
that I operate differently or we operate differently is remove the concept of transaction. Stop looking at things as a transaction and look at it as how can I add value? That's what the difference is.
Okay. Would you put my feet to the fire, please?
Yes.
Because I agree with you wholeheartedly at three different levels.
Okay.
First of all, transactionally speaking, the
Yes.
transaction is in fact a barometer.
Mhm.
It is not a leading indicator.
Right.
It is a barometer of the relationship so that the transaction occurs because of the amalgamation, the integration of the relationship. So if you focus on the relationship, it is a segue that the
Right.
transaction will follow. If I put the transaction ahead of the relationship, I become a peddler and it always blows up in my face.
Right.
Bingo. Secondly, corporations are notorious for this pushing on the transaction instead of giving the tools, as we
Yes.
talked about earlier in prospecting, but giving us the tools on how to build those relationships.
Coach.
Yeah. You call it coaching. Coaching is the word, but it's also taking a serious, caring interest in the employee. When you do
Cul-
that, hmm?
It's also culture.
Culture. It's a cultural thing to move away though, because I heard yesterday from somebody who has a very senior position in the air safety business. What could be more important than air safety?
Right.
Come on. And the whole emails they get over and again are who's in your pipeline this week,
Mm.
rather than saying airline safety is a very important thing, and we've got another tool here that might be is of interest. Here it
Right.
is. So
Right.
that's that. Now, the last one is this, though. When you say the transaction, it is true that I will engage a customer. We will do business eventually because of the relationship, and we now have a transaction. In your case, they bought real estate. In my case, they bought, I don't know, stocks or respectonomics, whatever it might be. But here is the one piece that misses in the sales. I don't know if I even call it the process of life.
Mm.
And that is that 3 or 4 months after the transaction, and you might say sooner, you might say later, that doesn't matter. But what matters is this: you do what's called an asset review. And the asset review has one absolute condition to it: there shall be no buying and there shall be no selling. The asset review is a mechanism that is designed to bring each other up to date. In
Right.
other words, if I've made a presentation for Respectonomics, I'll use me as an example, and we've had all the guts and glory and wonders of it. 3 or 4 months later, I call that same organization and say, these are the things that are happening in our life. I'd be interested in see how they're happening in your life and talk about how the two come together and how they've worked and so on and so on. It's called an asset review. And the reason you do it, it's one sense it's self-evident, because that way you keep in touch and you can find out how their lives are changing or my lives are changing. The information is changing. Your world, real estate market is in flux. So you can call back 6 months later and say, here's some information that would be of interest.
Right.
Here's the main reason. How often do relationships fall between our fingers?
All the time.
Yeah. So the asset review is a wonderful discipline, and you make that part of the original presentation that we do our business quite differently, and we conduct an asset review with you every 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whenever, whatever suits you. And that is a very, very comfortable. And I love your comment about non-transactional, because it is non-transactional with one little codicil. And I had to be very careful on this, that it's not manipulative.
Mm.
And that is, and an asset review is also a wonderful time to see if there's an opportunity for referrals. Because you say, if you're,
I don't think it's a negative thing because I think, or can be perceived as a negative thing. It, I think it
yeah,
depends on how you're presenting it, and
well,
I
yeah,
also depends on how you or how we navigate and manage and do
mm,
business,
mhm,
right?
yeah,
So if it's from always from a vantage place of what's how can I add value to you? What's my
Exactly.
service to you? Then
Yeah.
I don't think at any point in
No.
time, really, in that person or
Yeah.
the company or the corporation or whoever has had a good
Yeah.
experience with you and understands
Yeah.
the value that you've
Yeah.
contributed or brought,
Yeah.
I think it's a great opportunity to
Yeah.
see how can you also help
Yeah.
somebody else,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. I meant by the manipulative part of it is you're going in there to do the asset review on its own merits. That's all you're doing. You're not going there to get referrals.
No.
It's a railway track. It's a parallel construction.
So I
You
think
are,
that's organic in how you conduct yourself and what
yeah,
culture you've created
exactly.
in your
Yeah,
business, right?
right. Mhm.
Right. Yeah,
I think this is a message that every corporate marketing organization should be listening to.
agreed.
And I hope that our listeners are saying to their CEOs and their marketing people and the sales leaders and so on, listen up, because this is how great business is done and great business continues to be done.
And if so, companies or organizations or even small groups
Absolutely.
like additional information or
Yeah.
some guidance and assistance
Yeah.
with tools and resources on how they
Right.
can grow or develop these skills, where would they
Yeah.
reach out to Jeremy?
Well, they come to Jeremy at respectonomics.com. That's a good starting gate.
Yeah.
And listen to the other podcasts because do you know something? It's very interesting. The podcasts are all the same.
Mm,
They all come back to dignifying the other human being.
right,
Once you lose sight of that dignity and the essential quality of that dignity, then eventually the business starts fraying at the edges.
right.
So I think on that point, I'm going to say,
Yes.
I rest my case.
Thank you for your time today, Jeremy.
Thank you, Sarah.